Farah and Linda. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Christine. I'm the events manager here at Rizzoli Bookstore. And we're so honored and excited to be hosting the virtual launch event for Farah Nayeri's new book, Takedown, Art and Power in the Digital Age, which is out this week from Astor House. This was meant to be an in-person event, but the pandemic intervened. But we're just really glad to have the chance to gather virtually anyway and celebrate this book. And we're grateful to Farah, who's having a late night in London over there with us. So this event will be about an hour long, and we'll have time near the end for an audience Q&A. So please, as you listen, be thinking of your questions, share them with me in the chat box, and I'll pass them on to Farah and Linda, and they'll discuss some of them during the Q&A. Please just remember to keep yourselves on mute during this event. And if you've already purchased your copy of Takedown through Eventbrite, we thank you for doing that. And you should be receiving an email with either shipping information or information about in-store pickup. If you haven't gotten your email yet, you will very soon. And the same goes if you've purchased a gift card, you'll receive your code via email very soon if you haven't already. And if you would still like to get a copy, which we hope you will, you can buy it from our website or in person at our physical bookstore at 1133 Broadway, which is near the Flatiron Building. We have a lot of great in-person and virtual events coming up starting in mid-February. So please check out the events calendar on our website for those and follow us on Instagram. And we thank you for supporting Rizzoli Bookstore and for supporting great books from independent presses like Astor House. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Farah Nayeri is an arts and culture writer for the New York Times and host of the Culture Blast podcast. Originally from Iran, she lives and works in London. She's been a reporter for Time magazine in Paris, a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and a correspondent for Bloomberg in Paris, Rome, and London. In her new book, Takedown, she grapples with some of the most relevant and pressing questions facing art lovers and everyone adjacent to the art world today, such as who gets to make art and who owns it? How do we correct the inequities of the past? What do authenticity, exploitation, and appropriation mean in art? Tonight, she'll be discussing those questions with Linda Yablonsky, a critic based in New York who has spent the last 30 years covering artists, art issues, and the art world's social structure in places like the New York Times and T Magazine, Art Forum, and many more. She is the author of the novel, The Story of Junk, and is currently working on the first full-length biography of Jeff Koons, forthcoming from Henry Holt. So with that, let me turn things over to our speakers, Farah and Linda. Thank you both so much for doing this tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Hi, Farah, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. One only publishes her first book once, so I'm very pleased to be here with you at this exciting time, particularly for this book. Clearly, we live in a different world now than we had even 4 years ago, and unlike a lot of other things that happen in the world, this one has deeply affected the art world, artists, institutions, the market, and the social structure of who gets to be in it, and moreover, who gets to speak. Farah's book, which I read almost in one sitting, I ate it up, wades into this, the muck and mire of a lot of what we've experienced in the last 2 years. In particular, it's topical and current, and also somehow in the space of a fairly small space takes in the sweep of history going back to the Stone Age. So congratulations. Farah, what do we talk about first? Sex, money?
Oh, I don't. I thought
there's so many hot topics. I mean, the description Christine just gave is accurate, but I mean, you're really getting into so many emotional issues in the most level-headed, clear-eyed way. I've seen you're such a good reporter. And the book kind of summarizes a lot of the political, where the political winds have blown in the art world and how it's affected the art we see, how we understand it, and who gets to own it. Um, and that even though a lot of artists say they're not political, a lot of other artists say there is no art that isn't political, and you kind of prove the point. So let's start with why you wanted to take this on and how it came about.
Sure. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank Linda Yablonsky, the rock star of the art world, for agreeing to host this conversation. And as you can see, Linda is not only a great critic and a great personality in the art world, but she's also a great dresser. And I love that jacket. Anyway, Linda, yeah, just to answer your question, to be honest, it all started with a guy called Paul Gauguin, who you've all heard of. And in 2017, I happened to be interviewing Kehinde Wiley, the portraitist of Barack Obama, as we all know, painter of the presidential portrait. And I was interviewing him in London at a gallery show of his, and it was very soon after the Weinstein scandal. And we were talking about artists he loved, and he said, I love Gauguin, but, he really makes me uneasy, and he's just so creepy. And especially in this Weinstein era, I think Gauguin just looks, I feel very uncomfortable, very awkward about him, the colonial gaze. It's all just so creepy. And he made me think, because I was a pretty old-fashioned, museum lover, art lover, and a huge lover of Gauguin and his work, his painting, but I'd never really thought about Gauguin kind of seen through the prism of Me Too, or post-Weinstein or 21st century. And I thought, gosh, that's an interesting way of looking at this guy. And I knew there was a show coming up at the National Gallery in London of Gauguin portraits. So I went to my editor at the New York Times and I said, what about if I write a story about Gauguin, but sort of revisiting him through a Me Too lens? And the editor said, yeah, sure. So I went ahead to this exhibition, Gauguin Portraits, and it was in the fall of 2019, kind of expecting the National Gallery to take a very classic, old-fashioned, conventional approach to this artist, and really not delve into any of the louche aspects of his character, which were many. And to my surprise, I walk in and I see actually these wall texts that explicitly say, for the first time in any Gauguin show that I've ever seen, and I've seen many, that Gauguin had sexual relationships with 13 and 14-year-old girls, and that he exploited his status as a sort of French colonial personality or overlord or whatever to get what he wanted in Tahiti. And I just thought, gosh, this is quite unusual. And then I listened to the audio guide, and the audio guide had this line in it that said, is it time we stop looking at Gauguin altogether? So they were really re-examining Gauguin. I interviewed one of the chief curators of the show, Chris Riopel of the National Gallery, who's Canadian. And, he said, it's not enough to say that's the way they did it then. We can't really say that anymore. We really do need to re-examine how they did things then, meaning, his relationships with these teenager girls. So anyway, I wrote a story, and the headline was spicy. The headline was, is it time Gauguin got canceled? And that headline went viral, and it got attention, a lot of adverse attention from France and Italy, saying the New York Times is trying to cancel Gauguin. But then in other parts of the world, such as in Canada, such as New Zealand, Australia, and also, the United States, there was interest in, oh gosh, recontextualizing Gauguin. And I was approached by a very smart young agent whose name is Ross Harris, and from the Stuart Krzyzewski agency. And he approached me just out of the blue. And he said, how would you like to write a book sort of recontextualizing a lot of the art that we've seen and sort of looking at things through a new lens and all of that. And I thought about it and I produced a proposal and here we are. So that's the story, Linda.
But you didn't limit yourself to gender bias in your book. It's a much broader view than
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
also, I saw that part of, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of your motivation was discovering that as a journalist, you were complicit in
Mhm.
the public's perception of artists, not a voluntary, not on a voluntary basis, but that
Yeah,
you were caught up in the same bias that had gone on for centuries.
yeah. I mean, I basically discovered that in the course of the writing and researching of this book, Linda. That's what happened. In other words, the book kind of, in discussions with my editor, Alessandra Vastali, she was saying, well, make this book a journey, make this something readable and create some kind of thread that the reader can follow. So in this, I was basically telling the story of this journey, this quest that I went on to discover, um, how we perceive artists today, artists of the past, artists of the present, how censorship used to be top down and how censorship is now bottom up. It was sort of the concept that I came up with when pitching this proposal, this book to the publishers. And so I was telling the story of how censorship used to be top down, and that artists and painters would get censored, and the Pope would basically um, disapprove of whatever art they did, and then through the ages we had Hitler and Stalin and those kinds of authoritarian leaders censoring art. And now we have a censorship that comes from the actual people, a bottom-up censorship coming from citizens like you and me, voters, and people on social media. So I was trying to sort of tell that story of how top-down censorship has become now bottom-up censorship, thanks to sort of democratization that we've experienced in the Western world. And in the course of doing that, I kind of described my own trajectory, and I realized that my own coverage was quite gender biased. I mean, I was covering a lot of exhibitions, writing about a lot of museums, but the artists I was focusing on were very predominantly white and male and European, and the number of women I was covering was very, very, very small, and the number of artists, non-white artists, was even smaller. But I was, not really keeping a tally earlier on before I started writing this book. I wasn't sort of like counting artists or making columns or anything. But then when I went looking back, I realized that yes, I myself was predominantly looking at these kinds of white European artists, and it was no fault of mine or no fault of anybody's. It was sort of, that was the way of the world. That was the way museums did their programming. And as we all know, Linda, there were very, very few solo shows of women up until quite recently, not to mention solo shows of African-American artists, et cetera, et cetera. So I get into all that.
When you say bottom-up censorship, what are you actually saying?
Yeah.
What do you mean by censorship? Are you talking about cancel culture, so-called?
Yeah, I mean, that's a term that I kind of steer clear of, I don't really want it because it doesn't sort of really mean anything. But I think what I'm referring to is, I mean, I use censorship in a very loose way, because obviously people who are on social media and, ordinary folks like you and me, or ordinary citizens who create hashtags and create protests.
We're not ordinary, sorry.
Okay, people like you and me who vote and who can create protests and picket or whatever, or start a hashtagged community, those people have been known to exercise influence on institutions. I mean, the influence can be limited or it can be not limited, but there is that influence. And so I think that censorship is probably not the right word. I was just trying to be a bit schematic and saying top down, bottom up censorship. But I think that there is a fact that nowadays democracy, or the power and the authority over museums, is not just held in the hands of the museum directors. It is also held in the hands of the general public. And so there is, you know, the museums and the art world are kind of almost are being held to account by citizens. So yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Well, you paint in the beginning, you paint a rather rosy picture of this shift in power, this accumulation of voices, let's say, some of which can be more fascistic than the powers they're complaining about, and that I find very problematic. There's a chunk of your book that I was interested in because it was something I lived through, and I think a lot of people who read your book also lived through, which were the culture wars in the U.S. in the 90s. And I just want to interject that Farah limits herself in the book to Western democracies, where supposedly the free world. And so a lot of this is really focused on shows in America and Europe. You don't get so much into South America, Latin America. So the culture wars of the late 80s and 90s, when we were all kind of in an uproar, and you lay it out, the whole history, and that this happened bam, 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 one thing after another, starting with the controversy over Robert Mapplethorpe's show, The Perfect Moment, which had opened in museums in several cities before it got to the Corcoran in Washington without complaint, when our government suddenly got involved, and that is some people in Congress, just something we haven't seen so much since the Congress created the NEA in the 60s. And it was one alarming moment after another, where, speaking of censorship, I mean, senators were telling artists what they could and couldn't make art about.
Absolutely.
What do you, in your research, I'm just curious to hear from you, why do you think this happened in this span of a few years?
I think it's all about money. Money has a lot to do with it, and I think the Christian right in America has a lot to do with it. In other words, the Christian right from the late 1970s started to become extremely active in supporting the Republican Party and supporting individual candidates, funding them, lobbying them, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of these congressmen and women owed their seat to some of these groups. So there was that. And then there was the second factor, which is to say that the National Endowment for the Arts was a federal agency. And this federal agency actually funded the Corcoran, where Robert Mapplethorpe's exhibition was supposed to take place and didn't. It also funded work, contributed some funding, as you know, towards a work by Andres Serrano, Piss Christ, which is, you know, famous. I'm sure all of you have heard about it, but basically consisted of an image of a crucifix that had been plunged into a recipient of the artist's own urine. And so there were all these works that really became very, very inflammatory, and that senators and congressmen concerned themselves with, because these works were receiving federal funding. I mean, the whole thing was the taxpayers funding these works. How could the taxpayer be funding these sacrilegious, pornographic, sadomasochistic, works. I mean, catalogs were torn up in Congress and the Senate. They were trampled. I mean, there were these scenes that seem completely inconceivable today. And the real reason is that there was taxpayer money going to these artists in some form or another, or going to the museums that were showing them. And so I think that's really what made the whole thing just so inflammatory. The merger of or the confluence of the Christian right becoming more and more powerful under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and the NEA, this federal agency, being faulted for funding contemporary artists who were focusing on themes that were considered inappropriate.
Well, this was also the years of the AIDS crisis.
Yeah.
And homophobia had a lot to do with it. And the Reagan administration's pretty much, unlike, even Trump, developed a vaccine, we got behind, not developed, got behind a vaccine for COVID. I mean, we still don't have a vaccine for AIDS. There was no money being put toward research except privately. And it was a scary time, but the problems with the Mapplethorpe show had more to do with his photographs of young children who were naked. So there was a whole moral universe being tackled with here that was being forced down our throats, and that went on to David Wojnarowicz, who's became the focal point of this Reverend Wildman, and who sued him just successfully. Of course, he was given, his reward was $1, but it was the principle of the thing. And David was one of the most moral, upstanding people I ever knew personally. And to call him immoral was just, kind of projecting from the hypocrisy in our government. And then there was the NEA 4, and the result was that after several years, is that the NEA stopped giving grants to individual artists.
Right.
And it's and now we have a government. I mean, it used to be that artists of all kinds represented America all over the world and had backing, because our best ambassadors are our culture producers, and it's what people love the most about America, where there's a lot to not like at all and to object to, and the racial injustice, as well as the Me Too movements of the last several years, have really brought this to the fore. Battles we thought we'd fought in the 60s and 70s. And then I think you're right, money had a lot to do with the way things changed and who was in power. What's happening now that's different, and is it different, or is this a passing trend also?
I don't think this is a passing trend. I think that the real catalyst or watershed moments have been the two movements that have been created or have been catalyzed by two very, very serious episodes. The first is the Harvey Weinstein scandal, the revelation that this one man committed rape and sexual assault on a serial scale, and on a very great number of women, including some women who are very, very famous and who were actors and still are, and who people have heard of. So there was that, the hashtag Me Too phenomenon, born or not born, let's say, which grew out or developed from about 2017 onwards. And then there was the Black Lives Matter movement, which has basically existed since 2013, I believe, but which got this absolutely extraordinary, let's say, boost, if I can call it that, from the killing of George Floyd in 2020. And these two episodes, Weinstein and George Floyd, were crimes on a level that was just so off the charts, so absolutely unacceptable, that for some strange reason, these two events served as catalysts, the way I see it, of female, let's say, or women's progress, the promotion of women, the hiring of women, the raised profile of women on the one hand, and the promotion and hiring and recruitment and let's say, publicization, if I can call that, of African-American artists and artists who are non-white. So I think we have seen the museum world react extremely sharply and extremely decisively to both of these movements. I mean, look around you, look at the number of exhibitions of women artists, solo exhibitions that we are suddenly seeing in the major museums of the Western world. And I really mean suddenly, because honestly, before there were next to none. And look at the solo exhibitions of African-American artists or artists who are non-white, non-European in those museums, and they are also far, far more numerous than they were before. So I would argue, and I argue in this book, that what has really made change is these two movements, which have changed, I think, the status of women and the status of persons who are not of European descent in a way that is pretty startling. And I think you can see it in all walks of life. And I think the art and museum world is no exception. And personally, I don't think this is a flash in the pan. I don't think this is a fad. I don't think we're going to backpedal and go back to the way things were before. And I am not the only one to say that. I think, when I was speaking to Anne Temkin of MoMA, she said, the genie is out of the bottle. And I think, I would agree with her. And I've also, that's the title of my epilogue. So I agree that the genie is out of the bottle, and we're not going to be able to stuff that genie back into the bottle. And I'm not sure that anybody would want to. So I am fairly optimistic on that front.
You have some, speaking of chapter titles, some fairly provocative titles, like All Money is Dirty and Morally Reprehensible Trash. Take them all down. I mean, you're no wilting lily when it comes to these issues, I'm happy to say. A load of rubbish, which is how many people think about contemporary art. What's that chapter about?
I think A Load of Rubbish is a chapter that refers to public art, sort of, I think that refers to art and vandalism, that particular chapter.
Yeah,
I think it refers to this these works, the work of the bricks by the artist, I guess, Carl Andre. I think it was Carl Andre who was showing these an arrangement of bricks, which is a very, very famous minimalist work of his. It's an important work of his that is now in the collections of Tate, among other museums. And it was basically an assortment of bricks laid on the floor. And I think on that occasion, a tabloid in the UK turned around and called it A Pile of Rubbish. And these titles of mine are all derived from quotes from stuff that people have said. I mean, they're not my own judgments of these works, because I don't think that work by Carl Andre is a pile of rubbish myself. Yeah, I actually think it's an important work. In fact, the thing is, I have this really, like you, Linda, I love art, and I love art from every period, from Masaccio to Mapplethorpe. I just, I have a great love for it. And I have a lot of place in my heart for a lot of different artists. And so I am not judgmental in that way. I don't trash artists or say this one is crap or rubbish or bad or whatever. I describe episodes in which artists were taken down or attacked or censored or whatever, and then I kind of try and analyze and synthesize. So, but yeah, I just thought, I think with the editor's approval, I think we were trying to get some sort of slightly spicy titles for these chapters.
Well, some of this, if we can call it public art, also applies to museum catalogs and shows. In particular, you bring up the Philip Guston show, which has great catalog. The Richard Prince, the Spiritual America photo of Brooke Shields at age 10, being removed from both the exhibition and the catalog, taken away from the Tate Pop Life exhibition.
Yep, I was there, by the way, Linda. I mean, I know that you know Richard Prince and you know the background to this a lot better than I do, but I was there at the Tate at the press view on the day that they had the show, and I saw that Brooke Shields image on the wall. I remind viewers, it was an image. It's a photograph of Brooke Shields at age 10. She's not wearing anything. She's wearing a lot of makeup, and she's photographed from the side. And this photograph was, Metropolitan Police intervened after the press view, after we'd all been and seen it and got the catalog. Metropolitan Police intervened and took it down and said it can't be shown, because they'd read newspaper coverage saying that there was this naked image of Brooke Shields, and they were worried that it would be an infringement of obscenity laws. So they took it away, and the Tate took the catalog away. So, yeah.
This I know is a big surprise to the artists and the other artists in the show, who all expected that Jeff Koons's Made in Heaven paintings, which were also in the show, were going to cause problems.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the
Richard Prince.
They were in a room by themselves, and of course there was a little label in the room next to the room saying, that there are pornographic images of, Jeff Koons and his then wife Ilona Staller, alias La Cicciolina. And but yeah, no, I went. It was quite a large room. There were many photographs. They were very graphic, of course, as we all know. And I remember, this is a tiny little anecdote, but I remember standing in that room and looking at one of these paintings, and then a press photographer, one of the photographers who was there, was taking a picture of me looking at the photograph, and I turned to him and I said, "Sorry, can you please not take my picture looking at Jeff Koons' pornographic images?" And he said, "Yeah, okay, no problem."
Why, are you shy?
Yeah, I just didn't want to be in the newspaper examining a pornographic image of Cicciolina.
I don't know that they're pornographic. They're kind of
whatever
pornography.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, erotic.
But you also bring up the Anish Kapoor, the vandalism to Anish Kapoor when he had the Versailles.
Yeah,
and that seemed to have a racist element to it, as well as a sexual element. As far as protest.
Versailles is a real sensitive point. I mean, I remember when Jeff Koons was showing works inside the Palais de Versailles, there were these very, very conservative groups who were picketing and protesting, and I covered it. And as I walked past, I saw them, and they were really making a lot of noise about how dare this person desecrate this palace, this chateau, and the memory of our great kings by putting up these artworks that are so sort of sophomoric and silly, as is how they describe them. But the Anish Kapoor incident was far more serious, because he put a work in the garden that was sort of shaped like a large, let's say, court and steel horn, you could say. It was a giant cavity. It was quite spectacular. Unfortunately, I didn't see it myself, but I saw images. It was spectacular. And he put it in the gardens of Versailles, right next to the basin. And in an interview, he was basically talking about what this evoked. And he was talking about royalty and monarchy in very loose and general terms. And he said, oh, yes, well, this could represent the vagina of the queen. Le vagin de la reine is how it got translated. And he was speaking very loosely. I think he was even at one point even said Egyptian queen, but I think it was taken to mean Queen Marie Antoinette. And so there was this whole hoo-ha around that. And everyone thought that he'd insulted Queen Marie Antoinette by referring to her private parts. And Kapoor's work was vandalized, I think 3 times in the end. And there were all kinds of horrible inscriptions on it, anti-Semitic ones as well, because I believe he's half Jewish. And it was just quite very ugly. And I think Anish has decided, basically he decided to keep the slogans and to keep the artwork in its vandalized state. So that's what he's ended up doing. He was shocked and horrified by the episode, but rather than, scrub everything off and take the work away, he has kept all the vandalism on the work.
I hope everyone here tonight can tell how much fun it is to read this book by some of what Farah is describing. I want to, were not professionally trained in art. You're not an art historian. You are, I didn't know till recently, a concert pianist. But you came into art for the love of it, as did I, and the mystery of it. And I would like to ask you now, after all these years of writing about art and politics, what's good art for you?
Yeah, that's a really big question you're asking me there, Linda.
I know.
Well, I mean, I think good art, it just has so many different definitions nowadays. Since we've had modern art, since the early 20th century, basically, and people like Cézanne and Picasso and Braque and Cubism and Dali and Surrealism, and then all the way up to conceptual art, and then not to mention Marcel Duchamp, and not to mention a guy like Damien Hirst, whose early works were terrific. Art can mean so many different things now. And I think if I went to my grandmother or an ancestor of mine and I said, do you know that there is this artist who will come many decades from now and who will put a shark in a tank of formaldehyde and call it art? I think one of my ancestors, or even my father, my late father, who I lost at the beginning of the writing of this book, he would have said, you're mad. What kind of art is that? And how can you even define that as art? So, I mean, I think that the art that I consider good, I mean, my church is very broad, and there's a lot of art that I consider good, and great even. But to many people, it would really come across as, some of it would come across as deranged. But art can mean so many things, and the definition of it, of course, has been broadened and broadened and broadened some more. Everything has been done, the most salacious, the most risque performances. We had one artist by the name of Manzoni who actually said that he had canned his own excrement. I mean, we've had artists urinating, we've had artists, having sex live in front of other people. We've had artists shooting themselves. And all of these are actually works of art by my definition. So what's great art? Yeah, that, you know, how much time do you have?
Yeah. Well, I have all of my life. I have immersed myself in this. I would like to open this up to questions from other people. Let's see, what have we got here? If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat. What are your thoughts? This is from John. What are your thoughts related to the moral issues raised about Sally Mann's photographs of her family? Yes, I in fact talked to Farah about this very thing the other day when we were discussing this. You want to answer that?
Can you jog my memory, Linda? No, I mean, Sally Mann's.
The photographs of her children who were naked and hanging from meat hooks in one photograph, in regard to the Mapplethorpe pictures or the Brooke Shields.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to you on that one because those are not images that I know very well. So, Linda, if you don't mind taking that one.
Well, I didn't write your book, so I don't feel qualified to
yeah, unfortunately,
the moral issues. So it's a sticky wicket. You know, she was the mother. I don't think she thought she was. Well, I know actually she didn't think she was exploiting her children. They were her models, the same way other artists use their immediate friends and family as models, and she was making. They're beautiful pictures, but she did make them look dead, and the fact that she was their mother.
Yeah,
really
I mean, I have to say, there is a point that I would like to make in connection to that more, just broader point, and it is that children and the representation of children has become an incredibly sensitive issue. It's a lot more sensitive today than it was in past years, past decades. And I have an example in the book, a case study about Balthus, you know, the painter Balthus, and the fact that for many, many long years, people, including myself, would go and see Balthus exhibitions that showed very young girls maybe 12, 13 years old, 11 years old, who, you know, were like the Thérèse Dreaming, the famous painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, shows this young girl who's basically sitting on a bench, and she's got one leg up and one leg on the floor, and you can see her underwear, and it's a profoundly disturbing work. I can't really describe it in any other way now, and I think that there was a petition against it. I know there was a petition against it. Again, right after the Weinstein scandal, there was a petition against it. There was a group of women who petitioned and said, we want this taken down. The Met said they were not going to take it down. So it's still on permanent exhibition at the Met. But personally, as I write in my book, I just don't think that kind of work is going to be very, very popular going forward. In fact, it's not popular. And I'm prepared to bet that we will not be seeing major retrospectives of the work of Balthus in the coming years, because the representation of children is something that is extremely sensitive. That is truly one of the hot buttons of our time. And that's why when Linda was referring to the Mapplethorpe images of the two naked children, you know, that's again, that again also hit buttons. It hit buttons back then, and really nowadays I think it would really be impossible to exhibit in a major Western museum.
Well, I mean, everyone has naked baby pictures of themselves that their parents took.
Yeah.
Or that they took as parents.
Yeah.
So it's not that weird.
Well, naked babies is one thing, but when the child is a little bit more
well, it's depicted as a sexual being.
Yeah. I think that the fact is that we have found out a lot more about pedophilia than we ever did, that there are a lot of pedophilia rings, scandals, and there's a lot of coverage about it. We know a lot more about it. We're fearful of it. And therefore, even an image of a 3, 4, 5-year-old kid of any gender naked is, yeah, I don't know. I think it's doesn't go down well. In my view, yeah.
Okay. That's what we're trying to get here, is your view.
Yeah.
Well, Fred wants to know who designed your book cover.
So my book cover was designed by this fantastic designers. No Ideas. You can look them up on the internet. I think they're based in New York, and they're absolutely terrific. I mean, for those who don't remember what the cover looks like, it's a figure in a painting of some, old master or something painting, and which is blurred, and it has this eyeball that's crossed out and this title. So yeah, no, it is an absolutely terrific cover, especially when you actually touch it and you physically see it, because it looks even better in the flesh than it does in pictures. So I don't.
It's a good looking cover for sure.
Yeah.
Victoria says the question of what is good art is a legitimate question, especially if good, quote unquote, is not limited to some idea of ethically moral. But what is the difference between hoarders keeping their urine in bottles? Well, I don't know that happens. And the artist showing a container of his own urine. Is the only distinguishing factor that one is public, or that the artist has articulated his or her intention? So does art exist outside of any value system at all? Well,
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I think that, you're asking the question that conceptual artists have posed, for about more than 100 years, and one of the main ones is, well, the main one, I think the pioneer of it is Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp went to a store in New York and he bought a porcelain urinal, and he submitted it to an exhibition. And he said, this is art because I say so. I'm an artist and I went and bought this, and I'm parking it in this exhibition or in an exhibition hall, and I'm deciding that this is art because I'm an artist and I said so. So, the bottle of urine, if there's a bottle of urine and it's an artist who's actually kept that bottle of urine and who then pulls it out and exhibits it in an exhibition, then, there's an argument to be made that that is a work of art. However, someone who keeps a bottle of their own urine somewhere in their house, I'm not sure that would qualify as art. So art has been recontextualized a lot this past century, and it's all about context, I guess. It's all about who's showing it,
that value systems are a much bigger subject than we have time to address
exactly
today, but it is another thing that seems to be shifting in our world.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions from anybody? Here's one. Are you optimistic about the future of the art? What are the benefits and dangers of how this relationship between art and social movements has evolved?
Yes, I am optimistic, and because there have been a lot of benefits. If we just think about the funding of museums, that's a really fraught topic now. Yes. And it's a very transparent topic all of a sudden, but it wasn't transparent before, because you would have these major museums with massive capital projects getting money from people who had billions, but sometimes you didn't know where the billions came from and how they were made. And there's an artist who Linda knows much better than I do, even though I have interviewed her for my podcast, Culture Blast. her name is Nan Golden, and Nan Golden has played a pioneering role in using social media quite a bit. She definitely has social media channels as well as real life channels. Nan Golden has gone out there and picketed and had die-ins, as she calls them, and you know, she's had these major demonstrations outside major museums and inside major museums against the Sackler family and the fact that they are the makers of OxyContin, one of the worst opioids in human history, to which she was once addicted. And thanks to the efforts of Nan Golden, you know, the name of the Sackler name is coming down at the Metropolitan Museum. It's already come down at the Louvre. Then the Serpentine Gallery, which I live near, just took the Sackler name off one of their buildings, even though they were all recipients of Sackler family largesse. So, I mean, I am optimistic about the benefits of social media. There are also drawbacks of social media, but on balance, I think it gives the citizenry, if you want to call it that way, or the population or people or museum goers a voice. They didn't have a voice before. You know, if you were upset about the way a museum was being funded, if you were upset about corruption or about an arms dealer giving money to your local museum, what could you do before social media? You could go and write letters. You could, you know, have a demonstration outside with some, you know, billboards, but how far was that going to get you? Now you get together with a bunch of people, you create a hashtag, and the whole thing is it goes viral, and the museum becomes very scared. So, yeah.
Well, we had the Guerrilla Girls putting up posters and demonstrating and making a difference.
Absolutely. The Guerrilla Girls are extremely important, you know, extremely important. Absolutely. But even despite the Guerrilla Girls pointing out that there was only one exhibition by a female artist, one solo female artist exhibition all year out of 4 major museums, those museums continued to ignore women artists all the way up to, you know what I mean? It just, these things take a lot of time and they don't stick. You know, these feminists, these extraordinary feminist campaigns, somehow they don't stick. You know, why didn't all those feminist waves of rebellion and protest in the art world, outside the art world, go on and not kind of, why were they not rooted? Why did they not become rooted? This is the problem, is that things happen in waves. But I argue in this book that the campaigns we're seeing now are actually throwing down roots. That I think that, you know, the campaign again for gender equality, the campaign for racial equality in the world of art museums is throwing down roots. It's not, I don't think it's going to disappear. So that's why I would be more optimistic than not.
Another question, George Orwell famously wrote, "All art is propaganda." What are your thoughts on this? Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I always get a little queasy when people say all art is political. You know, it's like, yes, definitely a lot, you know, some art is definitely political, and a lot of the art, you know, Guernica is political. But if you're sitting there in your garden and you're making a watercolor, or you park your easel down by a lake and you paint the sunset, how is that political? So no, not all art is political. I don't think it is. So,
but the artist's politics may be called to question, and you know, if people don't like his or her politics or their politics,
yeah, but you know,
they might not get much exposure for their art. People won't stand for it.
That's true.
We come back to the question of who owns culture. You know, who gets to say what artists can make and who gets to see it.
I think stuff becomes political, Linda, when it's exhibited by a certain institution. As soon as an artwork goes into an important institution, politics enter into play, because these institutions are deciding which artists to show, deciding which artists not to show. So, you know, by virtue of being there, that artist then becomes political because they become part of a greater conversation, and a political conversation because somehow they won out over other artists. So whatever, you know, there's all the you know, rapport de force, as they say, you know, the power play that exists between human beings. But I think it's perfectly possible to have a beautiful work of art. You know, someone like could be you, Linda. Do you know how to draw? I don't know how to draw. But let's say you take out your sketchbook and you draw something, you know, and it's a flower. That's not a political, you know, that's nothing political about that. So yeah, I think the whole argument around art being political really again depends on context. I think context is key, and I think that context is key is probably one of the big messages, if there are any messages in this book.
What should the Boston, another question, what should the Boston Museum of Fine Arts do with its museum room dedicated to Gauguin's Where Do We Come From, What Are We, and Where Are We Going? Good question.
Yeah, keep it exactly where it is. Keep it absolutely exactly where it is. I would certainly not be in any way condoning the destruction or the removal or the takedown, to use the title of my book, of a work by Gauguin anywhere. The point is not that we're going to tear these down. The point is we just need to basically talk about who this person was. We can't sweep that under the carpet, which is what has been done all the way up to now. You know,
I understand the title of your book, by the way, Takedown, as not just to, you know, so-called cancel culture, but the taking down of the blinders. And you refer again and again in your book several times to blind spots that we have maintained for various cultural, racial, gender bias, whatever established it. And you are removing those blinders with this book. I wonder, before we close, so people can get a real sense of the flavor of the writing, if you would care to read a brief passage from the book?
That's very kind of you, Linda. I usually don't read because I don't want to bore people, but this is a request from Linda, so.
I don't think you're boring anyone.
So I'm just going to read from the first few paragraphs of my epilogue, which is something you get to at the very end of the book, but I think, you know, they kind of sum up the discussions we've had. The social upheavals of the last decade, as epitomized by the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements, have been unquestionable catalysts of change in the art world. They have accelerated a process that was otherwise proceeding at a sluggish and erratic pace: inclusivity. Today, museums, galleries, curators, and patrons all want to be seen as agents of that inclusivity. Their efforts may look, in some cases, like window dressing, hasty and superficial, yet there's no going back to the way it was before. As MoMA's chief curator of painting and sculpture, Anne Temkin, points out, the genie is out of the bottle. The art world today, while still a work in progress, is a better, richer, and more interesting place than it was before. True, some of the changes are motivated by cynicism, damage control, and fear of bad publicity. Nonetheless, arts programming has become less staid, less repetitive, and less blockbuster-led. Audiences are faced with a wider and more relevant range of options, and are visiting museums and arts institutions in ever greater numbers. Not only have museums not lost audiences in the process, they have gained new ones. There are those who are suspicious of this new age of inclusivity, who write it off as a burst of political correctness and view the beneficiaries as second-rate talents brought in to fill diversity quotas. Yet in the vast majority of cases, the artists emerging from oblivion and getting solo museum shows should have done so a long time ago. They have been unfairly underestimated for far too long.
Thank you, Farah. And I'd like to let everyone know that Farah will be in New York in April.
Absolutely.
Can you say why?
Yes,
What's
April 3rd
bringing
and
you here?
April 3rd and 4th, I'm going to be moderating a panel discussion at the Talking Galleries conference, which is held in New York this year. And so I'll have the pleasure of being in the city. And, you know, Linda, I look forward to meeting up with you finally. We were supposed to have this this conversation in person, and so we will have another conversation in person. And
I do enjoy talking to you. We've talked a few times in the last few days, and it's all been great. But when you're here, you can sign the book that I hope everyone here tonight will make themselves the owners of. It's really worth it, and raises a lot of questions we need to be asking right now. And I suppose in time we'll know the answers. I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. Yeah. Thank you both so much for doing this tonight. This is the book, and we hope you'll get a copy. It's available on our website, rizzolibookstore.com. It's available in our physical bookstore, which is on 1133 Broadway. And thank you both.
And can I say it's the only Rizzoli bookstore in New York? It's not a chain.
It's not a chain.
Astor House is not a huge company. It's an independent publisher and an independent bookstore. And, you know, I think we have to stand up for both in this time of mostly online shopping. You know, go to the bookstore, browse.
We agree. We're biased, but we agree, and we are open 7 days a week. We would love to see you in the store. We will have in-person and virtual events too. More of those to come in February. So please check out our events calendar, and thank all of you for being here tonight and for supporting this book and the bookstore. We hope you have a great night.
And can I actually thank Linda Yablonsky, who, as I said in the introduction, is an absolute rock star of the art world. She has 20,000 Instagram followers. I don't think I'll ever have that many. And just thank you so much, Linda, for your generous steering of this conversation. And you know, I really enjoyed it. You're great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for asking me to join you, and congratulations. You know, this is, I guess, a lockdown project, and you made the most of it.
I tried.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Have a great night. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
And thank you to all my friends who I see on the screen.
They're waving. They're saying thank you in the chat directly. Thank you. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.